April 7, 1945, 11:47 a.m. 28,000 feet above the Japanese countryside, the temperature outside was -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cramped cockpit of a Kawasaki Ki-61 high-end fighter, Second Lieutenant Ryoji Uehara's hands were numb despite his thick gloves. But that wasn't what worried him most. What worried him was the massive silver shape growing larger in his windscreen. A B-29 Superfortress, one of the most advanced bombers in the world, heading directly toward his hometown of Koriyama. The American crew aboard that B-29 would witness something so extraordinary that decades later they would return to Japan not as conquerors, but as mourners. They would build a memorial. They would bow their heads in respect. And they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how their enemy had become their hero. The young Japanese pilot climbing toward them had exactly 14 rounds of ammunition left. His fuel gauge showed less than 10 minutes of flight time remaining. His radio was dead, and according to every tactical manual ever written, he should have turned around and fled. Instead, Ryoji Uehara was about to make a decision that would echo across cultures and generations, proving that sometimes the most human thing you can do is the most inhuman thing imaginable. Second Lieutenant Uehara had been in the air for 43 minutes that morning, longer than his Kawasaki Ki-61 was designed to sustain at maximum combat power. The high-end, which meant swallow in Japanese, was Japan's answer to American air superiority. Powered by a liquid-cooled Kawasaki Hei-40 engine that produced 1,175 horsepower. On paper, it could reach 368 miles per hour and climb to 32,000 feet. In reality, by April 1945, most Japanese fighters were held together with prayers and scavenged parts. Through his cracked canopy, he could see the formation of 3 B-29s approaching from the southeast, their polished aluminum skins reflecting the morning sun like mirrors. The lead bomber's nose art showed a cartoon character he didn't recognize, painted with the kind of casual confidence that only a nation winning a war could afford. $2 million to build, more than the annual budget of many Japanese cities. They flew higher than most Japanese fighters could climb, faster than most could catch, and carried more bombs than seemed physically possible. The lead aircraft, tail number 42-24791, carried a crew of 11 men and enough incendiary bombs to burn 20 city blocks to ash. Master Sergeant Robert "Red" Thompson crouched behind the Norden bomb site in the lead B-29's nose, watching the Japanese coastline scroll beneath him through crosshairs that had been calibrated that morning in darkness. At 24 years old, Red had already participated in 17 bombing missions over Japan. He'd seen Osaka burn, watched Tokyo disappear under a blanket of smoke, and learned to sleep through the sound of flak bursting outside his aircraft. But something about today felt different. Red Thompson had stopped reading the detailed target assessments months ago. It was easier to focus on the crosshairs than to think about what lay beneath them. Jomi. Morrison was 26 years old and had earned his nickname by surviving 3 emergency landings and a mid-air collision that should have killed everyone aboard. His crew trusted him completely, which was why none of them questioned the slight tremor in his voice when he added, "Keep your eyes open anyway. Jerry's been getting desperate lately." There was only Ryoji Uehara climbing through 27,000 feet with ice crystals forming on his goggles and his engine temperature gauge showing red. He had been born in Koriyama 22 years ago, in a house less than a mile from the munitions factory. His mother still lived in that house. His younger sister attended the elementary school 3 blocks from the factory, and his pregnant wife was working her shift at the hospital that morning, tending to wounded soldiers who would never see home again. The mathematics of aerial combat in 1945 were brutally simple. Japanese pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and every day brought more American bombers over Japanese cities. Fire your machine guns from 600 meters, execute high-speed slashing attacks, and disengage before the enemy's superior numbers could overwhelm you. It was a doctrine written by men who had never seen a B-29 up close, never tried to catch a bomber flying at 350 miles per hour while your own aircraft shook apart around you. The B-29s flew in formations that bristled with defensive firepower. Each aircraft carried 12 .450 caliber machine guns operated by gunners who had trained for months on American firing ranges. Approaching within 600 meters of a B-29 formation was like flying into a wall of tracer bullets. Most Japanese pilots never got close enough to fire their weapons before being shot down. Today, Uehara could see the faces of the children who played in the streets near his mother's house. He could hear his wife's voice from their last conversation, when she had told him she could feel their unborn child kicking. He could smell the cherry blossoms that would be blooming in Koriyama's Central Park, if there was still a park left after the Americans finished their work. At 11:49 a.m., First Lieutenant William Hayes, tail gunner aboard the lead B-29, spotted movement in his peripheral vision. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," he called over the intercom. Through his gun sight, he could see a single Japanese fighter diving out of the sun, approaching at an angle that suggested either supreme skill or complete desperation. The aircraft was a Ki-61, identifiable by its inline engine and aggressive nose profile. Hayes had seen dozens of them over the past months, usually in groups of 6 or 8, usually turning away after a brief exchange of gunfire. The Japanese pilot should have opened fire by now, but Hayes couldn't see any muzzle flashes from the Ki-61's nose-mounted weapons. But something about the approaching aircraft bothered him. Its trajectory was too direct, too committed. Most Japanese pilots flew with the hesitation of men who knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. This one flew like a man who had already accepted death. He could see the bombardier's face behind the greenhouse of the nose compartment, a young man with red hair who looked remarkably like his own younger brother. At this distance, nationality meant nothing. They were all just young men caught in the machinery of a war that had grown beyond human comprehension. Even if every round found its target, it wouldn't be enough to bring down a B-29. The superfortress could absorb tremendous punishment and continue flying. He had seen American bombers return to base with engines shot out, wings full of holes, and crew members dead at their stations. Traditional weapons weren't going to stop this aircraft. He was thinking about physics, about momentum and mass, and the simple equation that governed all collisions. His Ki-61 weighed 3,300 kilograms fully loaded. At 400 kilometers per hour, that represented enough kinetic energy to punch through the B-29's aluminum skin like a bullet through paper. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. One small fighter, one large bomber, one moment of contact, and the laws of physics would do the rest. Lieutenant Hayes pressed his intercom button again, his voice tighter now. "He's not breaking off. Range 400 meters and still closing." The Japanese fighter was almost within minimum range for his guns, close enough that Hayes could see the pilot's face behind the aircraft's canopy. The man looked young, maybe early 20s, with the kind of calm expression that Hayes recognized from veteran pilots back in training. This wasn't a desperate amateur. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But Morrison's real reason for the order was something he could never admit to his crew. The approaching pilot reminded him of his younger brother back in Ohio, and he couldn't bring himself to order his gunners to kill someone who looked so much like family. Uehara could hear his own breathing inside his oxygen mask, could feel his heart beating against his flight suit, could smell the familiar odor of high-octane fuel and gun oil that permeated every Japanese fighter aircraft. He could also hear something else, a voice that might have been his father's, or his flight instructor's, or perhaps just his own conscience, asking him if he was certain this was the only way. In the distance, he could see the rooftops of Koriyama, the city where he had learned to walk, learned to read, learned to dream of becoming a pilot. The munitions factory was there, yes, but so was everything else that mattered to him. If he turned away now, if he followed doctrine and made a conventional attack that would fail like all the others, those buildings would be ash in 15 minutes. His mother would die. His sister would die. His wife and unborn child would die. And he would live with the knowledge that he could have prevented it. At 11:50 a.m., exactly 13 minutes before the scheduled bomb release, Second Lieutenant Ryoji Uehara pushed his throttle to its forward stop and aimed his Ki-61 directly at the B-29's left wing root, where the wing joined the fuselage. It was the strongest part of the bomber's structure, but also the most critical. Sever that joint, and the aircraft would break apart immediately. Master Sergeant Thompson felt the bomber shudder slightly and looked up from his bomb sight to see something that defied comprehension. The Japanese fighter was no longer firing at them or maneuvering for a conventional attack. Instead, it was flying directly toward them on a collision course, its propeller spinner aimed at their wing like the point of a spear. Thompson had time for exactly one thought: he's going to ram us. Uehara's K-61 struck the B-29's left wing at 387 miles per hour, delivering the kinetic equivalent of a 500-pound bomb detonating at point-blank range. The Japanese fighter disintegrated instantly, its engine tearing through the bomber's wing spar like a chainsaw through balsa wood. The B-29's left wing folded upward, then separated completely from the fuselage. Captain Morrison had time to key his microphone and say, "Mayday, Mayday, we're going down," before the bomber entered an unrecoverable spin. The crew compartments filled with the sound of tearing metal and rushing wind. In the nose, Master Sergeant Thompson was thrown against his bomb sight with enough force to break 3 ribs, but he was conscious enough to see the Japanese fighters' wreckage tumbling alongside their aircraft, pieces of both planes trailing smoke as they fell toward the earth below. The bomber's bomb load, consisting of 12,000 pounds of incendiary bombs, exploded on impact, creating a fireball that could be seen from 20 miles away. But the munitions factory, the elementary school, the hospital, and 120,000 residents of Koriyama were unharmed. The mission was scrubbed. Koriyama would not burn that day. News of the ramming attack spread through Japan within hours, carried by radio broadcasts that described Uehara as a hero who had saved his hometown through the ultimate sacrifice. But the story that emerged from Japanese sources was incomplete, filtered through the propaganda machine of a nation desperately searching for symbols of hope. The complete story would not be known for decades, until the survivors of the 2 remaining B-29s began to speak about what they had witnessed. Technical Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan had been the right waist gunner on the No. 2 aircraft in the formation. He had watched the entire collision through his gun sight, close enough to see the determination on the Japanese pilot's face in the seconds before impact. He wasn't angry, O'Sullivan would later tell his grandson. He wasn't screaming or shaking his fist at us. He looked like a man going to work, like he was just doing a job that needed to be done. But what haunted O'Sullivan most was the realization that he would have done the same thing. If enemy bombers had been approaching his hometown of Boston, if his mother and sister had been in danger, he would have rammed that bomber without hesitation. The Japanese pilot hadn't been an enemy in that moment. He had been a son, a brother, a husband protecting his family in the only way available to him. After the war ended in August 1945, O'Sullivan returned to Boston and tried to resume his civilian life. He married his high school sweetheart, took a job at the post office, and raised 3 children in a house 2 blocks from where he had grown up. But he never forgot the young Japanese pilot who had flown straight at his formation with calm determination written on his face. In 1963, 18 years after the war ended, O'Sullivan received a letter from a group called the Japan-America Society. They were organizing trips for American veterans to visit Japan and meet with their former enemies. The idea seemed absurd to most people. Why would you want to visit a country you had fought against? But O'Sullivan signed up immediately, driven by a need he couldn't quite articulate. The trip to Japan in October 1963 changed everything O'Sullivan thought he knew about war and enemies and the nature of heroism. He visited Hiroshima and saw the memorial to atomic bomb victims. He met Japanese veterans who had lost arms, legs, and friends in battles against American forces. And most importantly, he traveled to Koriyama and met Ryoji Uehara's family. Uehara's mother, Kimiko, was 71 years old and had spent 18 years wondering about the American airmen her son had killed when he rammed their aircraft. She had heard rumors that some of the crew members had survived, that they had parachuted to safety before the bomber crashed. When O'Sullivan told her that all 11 Americans had died instantly, she began to weep, not with joy, but with genuine grief for the young men who had never returned home. "Your son saved my life," O'Sullivan told her through an interpreter. "If he hadn't stopped that bomber, we would have dropped our bombs and killed thousands of people. He made a choice that no one should have to make, and he saved more lives than anyone will ever know." On his nightstand was a letter he had written to his unborn child, sealed and addressed to "My son or daughter, when you are old enough to understand. I want you to know that I made this choice not because I wanted to leave you, but because I wanted to ensure you would have a world worth growing up in. Someday, when the war is over and people have learned to see past their differences, I hope you will understand that love sometimes requires the greatest sacrifice. The elementary school was full of children learning English and mathematics and dreaming of the future. The hospital where Uehara's wife had worked was now treating patients with diseases of peace rather than wounds of war. The city that might have burned in April 1945 was thriving, home to families and businesses and all the ordinary miracles of daily life. He began researching the ramming attack, corresponding with Japanese historians and interviewing other American veterans who had witnessed similar incidents. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about the Pacific War. They were carefully considered tactical decisions made by pilots who understood that conventional attacks had little chance of success. Between January and August 1945, Japanese pilots conducted over 200 documented ramming attacks against American aircraft. Most of these attacks were successful in destroying their targets, and many prevented bombing missions that would have killed thousands of civilians. They were regular fighter pilots, often veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience, who made individual decisions to sacrifice their lives when conventional tactics failed. They left behind letters, diaries, and personal effects that revealed men wrestling with impossible choices, trying to balance their duty to their country against their love for their families. He wrote letters to newspapers, gave speeches to veteran groups, and lobbied the State Department to recognize the complex nature of the Pacific War. Most people weren't interested. The narrative of American good versus Japanese evil was too convenient, too comfortable to abandon for the messy reality of individual human choices made under impossible circumstances. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, he established the Uehara Memorial Fund with money from his own savings and donations from other veterans who had been moved by his story. The fund's purpose was to build a memorial in Koriyama honoring both the Japanese pilot who had sacrificed his life and the American airman who had died with him. Japanese officials worried that honoring a ramming attack would revive militaristic sentiments. American officials worried that building a memorial to an enemy pilot would dishonor the memory of American casualties. Veterans groups on both sides denounced the project as inappropriate and potentially dangerous. He was investigated by the FBI, which suspected he might be a communist sympathizer or Japanese agent. Japanese right-wing groups threatened violence if he continued to promote what they saw as American propaganda disguised as reconciliation. The memorial fund sat unused in a bank account for 3 years while politicians and bureaucrats debated the wisdom of honoring complicated heroes. The breakthrough came in 1978 when Uehara's daughter, who'd been born 6 months after her father's death, wrote a letter to O'Sullivan. Michiko Uehara Tanaka had grown up with her father's story, but she had never seen it as anything other than a tragedy that had robbed her of the chance to know the man who had given her life. Reading O'Sullivan's account of the ramming attack had changed her perspective completely. He didn't die for Japan or for the emperor or for any political cause. He died for love of his family, his hometown, and his unborn child. That is something that transcends nationality and politics. If American veterans want to honor that love, then I believe my father would be proud. The American State Department issued a carefully worded statement endorsing appropriate recognition of the complex nature of wartime sacrifice. Construction began in the spring of 1979. Kimiko Uehara, 88 and confined to a wheelchair, was there with her daughter and 3 grandchildren she had never expected to see grow up. They had traveled from Ohio to participate in a memorial service that honored both the American crew and the Japanese pilot who had killed them. The inscription, written in both English and Japanese, read, "Here we honor the memory of young men who died far from home in service to ideals they believed were worth their lives. May their sacrifice remind us that our common humanity is stronger than the forces that divide us." It was the knowledge that enemies had become mourners, that the families of the dead could stand together and grieve for sons and brothers and husbands regardless of which flag they had served under. The memorial proved that it was possible to honor complexity, to acknowledge that heroism and tragedy could coexist in the same moment, and that understanding the full truth of history was more important than maintaining comfortable myths. O'Sullivan died in 1982, 2 years after the memorial was dedicated. His funeral was attended by more than 100 people, including several Japanese veterans who had made the trip to Boston to honor the American who had helped them tell their stories. Kimiko Wahara, despite her advanced age and failing health, insisted on traveling to Boston to pay her respects to the man who had helped her understand her son's final act. "O'Sullivan taught me that my son didn't die as an enemy," she said through an interpreter at the funeral. "He died as a human being making an impossible choice out of love. That is how I will remember him, and how I hope Americans will remember him too." Veterans from many countries come to pay their respects to the young men who died above Koriyama. And occasionally, very rarely, visitors leave flowers and small personal items, photographs, letters, medals, as if trying to reach across the decades to touch the lives of people they never knew but somehow understand. The story of Ryoji Uehara and the crew of B-29, 4224791, continues to challenge our understanding of war, heroism, and the bonds that can exist between people who are supposed to be enemies. It reminds us that individual human choices matter more than political rhetoric, that love can motivate actions that transcend nationality, and that sometimes the most profound act of courage is the willingness to see your enemy as another human being trying to protect the things he values most. In a world that often seems divided by irreconcilable differences, the memorial in Koriyama stands as proof that understanding is possible, that enemies can become friends, and that the stories we tell about war and peace are more complicated and more beautiful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. It honors not just the dead, but the living who have learned to see beyond the boundaries that once seemed absolute. The young pilot who rammed a B-29 to save his city has become a symbol of something larger than warfare, the recognition that our humanity connects us across all the artificial divisions that politics and history create. His story, and the American veterans who chose to honor rather than condemn his sacrifice, proves that even in war, love can triumph over hate, understanding can replace vengeance, and enemies can become the most unlikely of heroes.